We good? Yep. Yay! Just got the signal. All right, thanks Puerto Rico for being there, and it's my understanding, I guess we're broadcasting in a lot of places, so again, for those of you who don't know me, my name is John Immel. I am really no one, I just got with a lot of big ideas. I really don't care for pedigree. I'm not interested in intellectual pedigree. I'm not interested in any form of authority. My goal is to persuade you with the most powerful argument I have, and then for you, with your own rational self-appointment, to arrive at solid conclusions for yourself. So, having said that, I did write a book, for those who care, Blight in the Vineyard, exposing the roots, myths, and emotional torment of spiritual tyranny. It is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble for those of you online, and I do have copies for those here. If you buy it from me here, you'll save yourself, it's $23.99 online. I'll give it to you for 20 bucks. You'll save yourself the shipping and $4 if you're inclined. So that was my shameless self-promotion. Read the book, it's actually pretty good.
It is.
Like this stuff. If you like the content of what I'm going to talk about, you'll definitely like it.
It's a good book.
All right, my job is explaining cultural impact. Now, that's a tall order, and there are three reasons why this is a tall order. Diagnosing a cultural disease requires being an epidemiologist. And to be an epidemiologist, you have to know what the pathogen really is. You have to know where the problem starts and then how to respond to them. And explaining the complex factors that impact all this takes a lot of time. Well, so my goal when I was thinking about this, and I've been thinking about this presentation for probably a solid 6 months, trying to figure out what I want to roll into it. I decided that for us to really understand where we stand in history intellectually, the only way to do that was to do a review of the development of Western thought, and pretty much to start at the beginning. And that means we're going to have to put on our thinking caps, because there's a lot here, and this is absolutely the longest. I've got 36 pages of notes to give you some sense of proportion. Now, of course, I know that this stuff is obscure to a lot of people. I get that. However, I'm confronted with the reality that if I let it be obscure, and if I cater to the fact that people will be uninterested, what that really tells me is I don't really believe what I have to say is important. And I do believe that what I have to say is important. My goal is ultimately to resoundingly condemn simple-mindedness as a virtue. Simple-mindedness is not a virtue. To be a human being is to engage your brain and to engage the world in which you live and take the responsibility for the content of your own mind and your own ideas. And if you hear any theme out of me at all, is that man must take responsibility for that. And I invite everyone to condemn simple-mindedness as a virtue. Every place you see it. Anytime you hear somebody, or you find yourself reverting to simple-mindedness as an explanation for whatever's happening, stop yourself, pause, interrupt the conversation, and refuse to let it persist. It is absolutely man's greatest vice. It is a worse vice than alcohol, it's a worse vice than methamphetamines. In actual fact, methamphetamines and alcohol and all other drugs are specifically designed to push the mind out of focus. Out of focus is the goal. That is the root vice. That was free. All right. What we will be discussing is, in my estimation, of incalculable importance. And I expect those that once you understand, not only will you come to understand, but those who do understand will be actually at the forefront of resisting the tide of collectivism that we're seeing wash across the face of this earth. To be sure, the resurgent neo-Calvinist ideology is merely, and this is important, it is a subset of a broader collectivist trend. We're making neo-Calvinism this big. Actually, neo-Calvinism is about that big in the global scope. And you'll begin to understand why I say that here shortly. If history is any measure, the neo-Calvinist movement and its intellectual children will go a long way to paving the way for the tyranny that is on the horizon. I firmly believe that the world is in peril, and specifically the United States. We are watching an inexorable trend towards collectivism in this country. The political evolutions, and if you watched my last session, you know that as I conceptualize the way man interacts with the world, from his metaphysical premise all the way down to his politics. Once you see collectivist politics in action, it is directly tied to the collectivist roots way back here. And what we are seeing now in our political ideology is an endless trend towards this kind of collectivism, and it always ends in tyranny. If you take any note today, take that one. Collectivism always ends in tyranny. Now, since I'm going to start at the basics of Western thought, and I know that this is a room full of Christians and we got Christians watching online, I fully expect you to think what I'm saying is disturbing. I fully expect that. So, from the 10,000-foot view, let's get started. This is a John Immel original, as always, as my endless effort at self-aggrandization. The Gospel according to John Immel, chapter 2, verse 1. Man abhors chaos like nature abhors a vacuum. If you look at your life, your greatest miseries are when chaos prevails. Your greatest joys and pleasures are when you bring order to the world in which you live. And I don't care if the world in which you live is as narrow as cleaning up the toys of your kids that your kids were playing with in the living room. You will take great satisfaction with taking that chaos and bringing it back to order. I believe this is part of the nature of how we are built. I contend that the nature of human existence, we are the order bringers. Having been created in the image of God, God is an order bringer. He is a life bringer. Being created in His image makes us order bringers. We are life bringers. With that understanding, the nature of our challenge in this earth has always been to rule and subdue the chaos that is around us and to produce order in whatever we choose. And this is going to be a radical thought for many of you. The purpose of your life is the purpose of your life. It is your job to find your meaning in context to the work that you do and the identity within the world in which you live. You are the order bringer of your life. The absolute that you are looking for is staring you in the face when you look in the mirror. You constantly look. Man's greatest pains come when he looks outside at the chaos in an effort to find order and an absolute. His greatest pleasure, his greatest satisfaction, his greatest joy is he finishes his work and he goes, it's good. Now can I share it with you? And that's exactly what God did. God took 7 days, created the earth, and said, hey, this is really cool. You want to play? With that in context, when you understand that, you will understand what happened in Western thought. Actually, this is the global evolution of human thought. But primarily, the reason Western thought stands so profoundly unique is they arrived at some revolutionary concepts, absolutely independent of anything else. We're going to start, and let's go to, go ahead and hit the next one. The obsession begins with, man looked around, he looked around at the tides of change everywhere. He saw chaos everywhere. He saw the oceans rolling, he saw the mountains upheaving, volcanoes, he saw tornadoes, he saw natural disasters, he saw social evolutions, he saw conquest and counter-conquest, wars and famines and destructions. And he looked around and he said, where can we find order in the chaos? The constant disarray told him there is in fact no order. The question was, how do we make sense of this all? So, this is my timeline. For those of you who are online, who are actually looking at it, take a minute to actually look. Those of you in the back, you can actually see this, yes? Now, I want to explain some parts and features of this particular timeline. Notice, we're starting at 600 BCE, before the Common Era. Okay? 600 BC, this is 600 years before Jesus, right? And my timeline goes to 450 CE. And my last person on this list is Augustine. And that'll make more sense why. This is the evolution, this is the progression, and I've skipped a lot of individual people. But these are the high points. Each person here represents a new idea in the evolution of human thought. Now in the West, we are the direct recipients of this progression. Now this progression isn't specifically evil. We've said a lot of bad things about Plato, and ultimately there's some profoundly serious problems with Platonism. But all of these men, there's nothing nefarious in what these men are doing. There's nothing specifically evil. They are trying to answer a very fundamental question. It's the same question that we asked ourselves when we were old enough to look at the world and go, this is scary. And all they're doing is trying to figure out how to make sense of it all. And past the age of about 7 or 8, and the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus don't make sense anymore, they had to start asking themselves some really genuine questions. So the first guy who actually tried to do this, his name was Thales. He lives, when I say he lives, of course, pardon the lack of academic precision. All of these guys flourished, and there's a time frame within which they flourished because we don't know. We don't know hard dates. But we know generally that this is when they existed. Thales exists about 585 BC. He was one of the first people in Western thought to take a stab at answering this question. And for this reason, he is regarded as the father of philosophy. He lived in a town called Miletus, a town in Asia Minor, hence the name of the school he founded called the Milesians. Only 4 sentences from his work survive, so it takes nothing to master what he said. However, we can reconstruct his ideas from his disciples and other sources that reference the Milesian school's tradition in subsequent centuries. Here is Thales' theory. The universe is made up of one substance. Computers, stars, apples, theologians, they all boil down to one stuff. His assumption was that if we could identify one substance, that we could understand how everything fit together. We would have an explanation for the chaos, because even the chaos would be reduced down to this one stuff. This is called monism. Now his reasoning went like this. If there is a universal stuff, man can explain how everything is related. Here was the first question. Why is it important why is this an important thing to identify? Here's the answer. Because if everything is one substance, then we will be able to explain change. Now in this context, when I say change, ultimately think chaos. Understand? Yes, no, yes. All right. Computers and toe jam and mayonnaise and redheads are all really different forms of this one substance. And that means we can deal with change because we can identify this one substance. In Thales' mind, it followed that all the chaos around us is really just another form, make a note for you Platonists, another form of this universal stuff. This would be the common denominator tying everything together. In other words, man can understand the order of things. For Thales, this universal stuff was water. While it seems absurd to us from his point of view in the intellectual development of his peers in his time frame, this seemed utterly logical. Water was the stuff that took the form of three forms: solid, liquid, gas. Water seemed to be able to turn into air because you put it in a bowl, you left it out for a day, the next day you came back, it was gone. When you dug in the earth, you dug down far enough, eventually the earth turned to mud and then eventually turned to water. And after the rains, it seemed that if you went to a mud puddle after the rains, you would find things that were alive in there. So in his mind, this one stuff was water because of all of these, what he considered to be objective, observable things. Yes? Even though he got the wrong answer, here is what is important by geometric factors. He is the first person in recorded history to employ a scientific approach. He is observing the world and drawing a conclusion. This is the essence of science. And for the first time, he gives an explanation for the cosmos that isn't related to some god somewhere. When I say we have a hard time from where we sit in history, because we are so familiar with the scientific methods. And our minds are geared from the time we're very small to make these rudimentary types of observations. But this was not so in the ancient world. In the ancient world, everything you looked at was some form of God. So the air you breathed was a god. The grass you walked on was a god. Everything you touched was a god. So the explanation universally was the reason things are is because the gods have done it. what Thales did is the difference between the little kid that believes in Santa Claus and the 12-year-old who is finally being introduced to math and calculus. He's finally being introduced to the rudiments of science, to look at something, make an observation, and draw a conclusion. It is my understanding this was the first naturalistic approach in understanding the world. As I said, historically, the binding theme was the explanation for everything was somehow mystical. So note, so here's the key point. Thales' concept of how to deal with chaos, this one stuff, was all done by observation. This is key because we're going to build on this presumption. Go to next, do the next one. Yes. All right, our next thinker is a man called Heraclitus. Heraclitus, roughly 535 BC. Actually, let me do a caveat first. My goal is to highlight the highlights. So I'm going to skip a lot of people. Now, there are a number of people that come between Thales and Heraclitus that get honorable mentions in the evolution of thought, but for the most part, they're irrelevant because he's actually a major player in what comes next. He also had a school, pardon me. He also had a school, but I don't know what it was called. It doesn't matter. 130 fragments of his work survive, and as does the roots of his philosophy. Here are the basic concepts. Heraclitus used the word logos to describe the defining force behind the universe. However, he didn't use it like the Christians use it when we're talking about the Gospel of John. Logos has a number of interpretations and usages. Most Christians are familiar with the Stoic interpretation that logos equals the Word of God. But that is not how it is used by Heraclitus. He thought that the logos had immeasurable properties, as if it were some extra worldly entity. But his writings are obscure, and so it's kind of tough to peg him down. Now, this is the note that I want you to take away. Man is not able to understand logos. The universe is in constant change. His aphorism describing this concept survives to this day. Ever newer waters, this is Heraclitus, ever newer waters flow on those who step into the same river. Or you can't step into the same river twice. He is basically telling us, his worldview is that no matter what you do, it is in constant change. He describes reality as a unity of opposites, which meant that all existing entities, being characterized by pairs of contrary properties, he described this idea like this: the path up and down are one and the same. Here is Heraclitus' explanation for change. Reality's essential nature lies in being both the same as itself and different from itself. In order to change, a thing must become different from itself. If it remains the same as itself, it hasn't changed. But also, after it has changed, it must still be the same thing. Otherwise, there has been no change, but simply the substitution of one object for another. If changing thing then is an identity of opposites, it is both is and is not. And what was and was not, what it will be. Okay, clear as mud, right? It gets worse. Now remember, everyone is trying to answer Thales' observation. What is this universal stuff? Don't lose track of the thread here. Heraclitus says, wait a minute, I don't know what you're talking about. This one stuff, this universal stuff. I don't understand. I look around, I don't see one stuff. I see lots of stuff. When I look, I can't find anything everywhere. Not water, not air, not fire, not even Oreo cookies. So here's what I see. I see everything changing. I see everything becoming. That was his definition of change, becoming. becoming what? Something else. His conclusion was that everything changes all the time. It is change that is the governing force of the universe. It is change that is the governing force of the universe. In other words, his one stuff is change. Now you can understand why Heraclitus arrived at this disastrous conclusion. There is no, actually, it is change in the governing force of the universe. Now his river metaphor makes sense. And now you can understand why Heraclitus arrived at this conclusion. There is no such thing as a universal stuff. On the contrary, there are no things at all. No pots, no paint pans, no dust mites, no neo-Calvinists, because everything is changing into another entity. There are no entities at all. Now, what does that do to human epistemology? That poses a monstrous problem. If you can arrive at the conclusion that there are no entities at all, what then does man do? Let me show you how serious he was about this. This is actually from a guy by the name of Gordon H. Clark, Thales to Dewey, A History of Philosophy. Go ahead and hit the next slide for me, please. I tell you what, I'm going to let you guys, can you guys in the back read this? Yes? No? Okay, I'm going to let you familiarize yourself with that before I read it. Okay, here's how Gordon Clark summarized the implications of Thales' premise. All things flow. No man can ever step twice into the same river. How could he? The second time he tried to step, new waters would have flowed down from upstream. The waters would not be the same. Neither would the bed and the banks be the same, for the constant erosion would have changed them too. And if the river is the water, the bed and the banks, then the river is not the same river at all. Strictly speaking, there is no river. When people talk about a river, they suppose that a name applies to something that will remain there for a time at least. But the river remains there no time at all. It has changed while you were pronouncing the name. There is no river. Worse yet, you cannot step into the same river twice, because you are not there twice. You too changed. And the person who stepped for the first time no longer exists to step the second time. Persons do not exist. Go ahead and hit the next slide. We're now at the second slide 5, Gordon Clark 2. Go ahead and read that for me. Get briefly familiar with it. Gordon Clark continues, when anyone says that something exists, the meaning is that that something does not change, at least for a short time. An object that is real must be an object that stands still. Suppose a clever sculptor takes a lump of children's modeling clay and begins to work it rapidly. It shortly takes the appearance of a child's teddy bear. And if the sculptor should stop, we would call it a teddy bear. But he doesn't stop. His nimble fingers keep working, and the momentary bear turns into a small statue of Zeus, only quickly to disappear into the form of the Empire State Building. But what is it, you ask? The answer is not that it's a bear or a god or a building. Under the circumstances, we could call it we could say that it is molding clay, and that we could call it clay because the clay remains the same through the change. But if the clay itself never remains the same, if it changed from the clay to wax and then to paper mache and so on, and never stopped changing, we would call it nothing. Nothing that it does, that is, it does not exist. It is unreal. This is the implication of what Heraclitus said. And Heraclitus' idea was profoundly influential. This is the heart and soul. When you hear somebody tell you that reality isn't real, this is Heraclitus. When they say there is no absolute, that's Heraclitus. Are you dizzy? I suspect you are, but let me tell you, this is by design. Question. If you think that chaos is the core of existence, what does that do to man's senses? I'm actually looking for an answer, it's not rhetorical. What does that do to man's senses? If you think chaos, go ahead.
You think chaos is what?
If you think chaos is the core of existence, man's existential reality is chaos, what does that do to his senses?
Strips them of hope.
Strips them of any effectiveness at all.
So it just shorts them out.
Yes, exactly right. That's exactly right. Man's senses are invalid because while they show us solid things, reason explains that everything is changing. Therefore, man's senses must be too base, too unrefined to understand reality. Go ahead and hit the next slide for me, please. This is the source of the two realms philosophy. This poses a huge problem for human existence. The solution, therefore, was to his solution, his answer to Heraclitus, or his extension of Heraclitus' ideas, posed a huge problem. So the solution, therefore, was to divide reality. Because we also know that things can't always change, so we have to have some form of constancy. So how do we do this thing? So he came up with two realms, the realm of reason and the realm of appearance. In the realm of reason, reason has the capacity to understand the constant change. Reason has the capacity to understand the Heraclitean flux. The realm of appearance is shaped by the human senses. It is reality as it appears to man, but the senses are shorted out. Two realms. Anytime you hear somebody start talking to you about two realms, when they start dividing reality in half, this is Heraclitus. So here's the point that I want you to take away from this. Heraclitus equals chaos is the natural state of the universe. Human senses are ineffective, and reality is divided. Okay, go ahead and hit the next slide, please. Okay, we're moving forward. We're now up to Parmenides. Parmenides flourished in 515 BCE. He is opposed to Heraclitus. He is opposed to the view that everything is an identity of opposites and that everything is becoming. Parmenides bases his entire thought on this one principle. What is, and what is not. He contended that nothing cannot be. Let me say that again because that tends to play on your head. He contended that nothing cannot be. In other words, you can't have nothing and to be something. And here's the way that Parmenides made his point. Here's how he said, "For never shall this prevail, that things that are not are, thinking and thought that it is are the same, for you will not find thinking apart from what is, in relation to which it is uttered. For to be aware and to be are the same. It is necessary to speak and to think what is, For being is, but nothing is not. Helpless guides, and this is actually his criticism of Heraclitus, helpless guides that wander through, helpless guides, the wandering through, oh, for heaven's sake, John. Helpless guides, the wandering thought in their breast. They are carried along deaf and blind alike, dazed, beasts without judgment, convinced that to be and not be are the same and not the same, and that the road of all things is a backward turned one. He didn't like Heraclitus at all. His conclusion was, existence is an obvious fact. Existence is universal. Existence is eternal. Therefore, non-existence is impossible. A thing cannot disappear, and something cannot originate from nothing. So man can't even think about what does not exist. That which does exist is called the Parmenidean One, which is timeless, uniform, and unchanging. And last, Parmenides goes on to argue that movement was impossible because it requires moving into the void. Now here's the thing he's got. He's got existence, but now he has to figure out how to deal with the implications of change. And so his solution is to decide that it's really not possible at all. Here it goes, his logic. How could what is perish? How could it have come to be? For if it came into being, is it not, nor is it ever going to be? Thus coming into being is extinguished and destruction unknown. I'm actually going to skip the next one. That makes the case mostly, and most of these are hard to read and hard to hear, so I'm just going to summarize. Now I want you to notice that Parmenides is actually the early form of Aristotle's laws of logic. Existence is existence. A is A. The law of identity. What you see is exactly what you see. There is actually no disconnect here, which is a substantial leap forward in the evolutions of human thought. Unfortunately, Parmenides drew an erroneous conclusion, which is understandable when seen from context from the Heraclitean flux that they were trying to counter. Here's what he concluded. The world is packed completely full. There are no holes and no spaces, but rather one big slab of stuff. The conclusion was that change was impossible. He meant any change of any type, motion, alteration, course correction of any kind. And of course the logical conclusion of this premise is that there is no such thing as talking, moving, smiling, bike riding, waves on the ocean. It's all a gigantic illusion. Therefore he concluded there is no change at all. This world is completely motionless in every respect, and the way we explain change is that we see, ultimately we are calling man's senses into question. Now notice, Heraclitus decides chaos is everywhere. Parmenides says, no, there is no such thing as chaos, it's all one. There is nothing that changes. But both of them decide the culprit is man's senses. The failure is man. Now, make that note because you're going to see that repeatedly. We're going to move to Zeno, and I want to actually address Zeno because it's a very common proof of the Parmenides principle. He was Parmenides' disciple. He lived, he's actually not on there, so you can just leave it there. Okay. He continued the arguments against the Heraclitean thought. His goal was to prove that movement was an illusion, and plurality and change was impossible. His proofs, the one that I'm going to read you, was said to support Parmenides' conclusions. Here is his most famous paradox. This is from Aristotle's Physics. That which is in locomotion must arrive at the halfway stage before it arrives at its goal. Now, this is basically the endless half-life of infinity. You can't ever cross a room. The theory is you can't cross the room because for you to cross the room, you'd have to cross half. And then you'd have to cross half of that. And then you'd have to cross half of that. And then half of that, and 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 half of that, to the point that you could never actually arrive at your destination. And his goal, remember, now we're still trying to figure out Thales' original question. What is this one stuff? And Heraclitus says, oh my God, there is no one stuff. It's all change and it's all chaos, and oh my God, what are we going to do? And Parmenides says, no, it's all stale, it's all stagnant. And these are the collisions that we have. And he's using this to explain how this can be. He's using to deny the implications of change, which is effectively motion. Since crossing a room, let's see. All of the rest of his arguments are pretty much summed up the same way. If you want to test your reasoning skills, do a web search on Zeno's paradoxes. There are 9 paradoxes to wrap your head around. They're actually, if you understand Aristotle's law of identity, unraveling Zeno is trivial. Now you can see the utter quagmire that Western thought is in. Now mind you, this is a monstrous step up from the rest of the world that is still under the tyranny of pantheism and the endless cycles, man is nothing more than a cog in the wheel of life, birth, death, life, birth, death, life, birth, death. And there is no change, there is no forward motion, there is no improvement, there is no concept of blessing. These are all uniquely Judean thoughts, basically from Yahweh. Those have yet to even become close to get into the universe. So these are light years forward. The development these men are making are light years forward compared to everybody else. Okay, how long have I been talking? Let's go ahead and hit the next slide, which should be the Pythagoreans. Okay. Yes, for those of you who are noticing on your timeline, the Pythagoreans actually came right after Thales. I skipped them because I wanted you to understand the scope of the issue, and they are unique. The Pythagoreans, and because they're a school, while they existed, they started here early. They actually have impact pretty much all the way down the timeline. So the Pythagoreans in the 5th century BCE, notice, like I said, where they are on the timeline. I want you to understand where they are on the timeline, particularly in relationship to where Christianity actually shows up. We've got almost 500 years here that are going to develop. And I am confident you will find the Pythagoreans disconcerting. Okay, when we talk about the Pythagoras, we are really referring to a school that he founded. We know almost nothing about Pythagoras specifically. What we do know comes from a whole scope of literature that came out of the school and from other writers like Parmenides and Plato and other historians. I want you to make this note. The Pythagoreans profoundly impacted Plato. This is the root source of probably 65 to 70% of Plato's ideology. Not least of which was the mathematics, but you'll see the other stuff that's important. Most of you, of course, have heard of the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus times b squared equals c squared. It is most often attributed to Pythagoras, but it was most likely a product of someone else within the sect. They were a communistic religious school, and many people contributed to the school's intellectual content. While this equation and many other mathematical proofs is attributed to Pythagoras, it is more accurate to understand their intellectual movement is substantially beyond its founder. Their claim to fame is primarily rooted in their extraordinary work in mathematics, music, and astronomy. Scholars talk of early, middle, and late Pythagoreans, but for our purposes, these distinctions don't matter much, because as you will see, their influence continues to this day. In contrast to the other thinkers that we have discussed, and this is actually a crucial distinction that I want to make, this group was a group of the Orphic mystery religions, meaning that the previous thinkers were secular by comparative standards. While we would call Plato a pantheist, the fact of the matter is that by comparison, he was an agnostic at best. These guys, I thought about actually reading you specifically from their Orphic religions, and I just thought it was tedious, so I decided not to. But take any mystical cult sect you can think of and multiply it by about 100. You get these guys. They were frenzied hedonists, but they introduced the concept of asceticism. Their preoccupations with the gods and the spirits and the demigods and so forth was off the charts. Now remember, everyone is still trying to solve the problems posed by Heraclitus and Parmenides. The Pythagoreans came up with this answer. They continued with the concept. They actually took the division and proposed two worlds. The Heraclitean world is the one of constant flux. The Parmenidean world is immutable, but sensory. Okay? Now here's the important distinction. Listen to the Pythagoreans' dominant theological themes and you will understand why they arrived at this conclusion. Listen. In the beginning, the soul was a godlike creature inhabiting another superior spiritual world, but it sinned. Does that ring a bell to anybody's mind? The result was that it fell from favor with the divine and lost its access to the mysteries. Ever heard this before? The punishment was being condemned to live in the flesh in this earth. The body is therefore the prison or the tomb of the soul. Now watch what happens. Here's what they do with man. Man has two parts. His high part and his low part. His high part is eternal. His low part is flesh and in constant conflict with the eternal part. Where have we heard this before? The high part is the soul, the low part is the body. The human soul is divided and is divine and immortal. The human soul is divine and immortal, but doomed to live for a period in the grievous cycle that lives incarcerated in flesh. This was called the wheel of birth. Now, what they ultimately ended up believing was a variation of reincarnation, transmigration of souls. They believed that you lived in this divine state, your specific function was you were born into the flesh, you were incarcerated for your sins, and you were supposed to work out these sins by virtue of living once again in this life of flesh, and then if you failed and you were subsequently judged, you came back. And they actually did transmigration of souls, which is actually animals. Reincarnation is specifically into another human body. You could come back as either animal, insect, water, fish, doesn't matter. Soul purification is achieved through an ascetic life, which was combined with secret initiation rites that facilitated a release from the bondage of the flesh for an eternal communion with the divine. Where have we heard this before? This is the precursor of the Gnosticism that everybody fusses about in the 1st and 2nd century. This is the roots of this. We have a mystery religion. We have man in a flesh body that is functionally depraved, needing some form of enlightenment that is given to him by the gods that is unique to a select few. This is where it starts. They said failure to live a pure life brought punishments after death in the lower planes of the underworld. Harmony is divine. Disharmony is material and flesh. And now you can see why they arrived at a duality of existence. Their religious worldview led them to conceptualize two different states, but they didn't leave it there. The Pythagoreans identified three kinds of men: the theoretic, practical, and the apolistic, or I think it's apolistic. The lowest class of man, the theoretic, is a crass materialist. The man only committed to material gain and the preoccupation with his fleshly life. The next class, the practical, is the class of man who comes seeking to participate in enlightened action. They want higher virtues, but they are still physically working to attain those values. The highest class of man are those who simply look at life. They are the highest purification because they exist in pure contemplation. It is the philosopher who contemplates about science and mathematics, who is released from the cycle of birth. The pure mathematician's life is the life of the highest plane of existence. Of course, they decided that mathematics and science was the highest, purest contemplation. It is really the root desire to free oneself from the flesh, and freeing oneself from the flesh became the ethical ideal. Now you can absolutely see the introduction of the soul-body dichotomy in Western thought. This is where it all originates. Your cross story, glory story, soul-body dichotomy. Augustine's original sin, soul-body dichotomy. Plato's philosophy that only works out that basically says the masses are depraved, fundamentally depraved, and you have an oligarchy who is in charge of the ruling, governing masses. Two worlds, separation. He actually decided that the reason the philosophers were a better class of people is by virtue of their enlightenment. And this you see, when you see the soul-body dichotomy, this is the ultimate end. It's always dividing humanity. See what's going on? Okay. Not only did they conceptualize two worlds, but they added the concept of a fundamental depravity of human existence. Heraclitus and Parmenides assumed that man's senses were suspect because it wasn't a metaphysical corruption. This is important. They assumed that his senses were shorted out. Great way to put that. But it wasn't a metaphysical corruption. It was only an inability. This turns it into a metaphysical corruption. Man's senses, because he is mere material, he is necessarily depraved. So the question is, of course, since they were a mystic sect, why would they become so dominant? And it's important to understand how they ended up being so compelling. Throughout history, there have been many mystery religions, most of which you will never know or existed. By definition, the mystery dies with the last guy who knew the secret. But the Pythagoreans sustained mystical influence because their advances in science were so compelling. Words fail when trying to describe the Pythagorean impact of music, math, and physics. Their work in mathematics and scientific discovery makes possible Kepler, Newton, and Einstein, for heaven's sake. We don't get to them. We don't get to the moon without the Pythagoreans. Without the Pythagorean foundation, physics would be impossible, which means pretty much everything that we see would not exist. So their mystical metaphysical worldview piggybacked into subsequent generations of thinkers because of the power of this part of their ideas. And this really actually shouldn't be a surprise. Frankly, Christians do this kind of thing all the time. I don't know how many times I've realized that we presume that if a person has one crucial thing right, that he must have the authority to have everything else right. So they accept, rather uncritically, whatever comes out of the preacher's mouth. And, of course, my case in point, how could C.J. Mahaney have ever gotten to where he is without this presumption? That was a joke. Sorry, C.J. Okay, so here's the summary comments. With the Pythagoreans, we see the introduction of the soul-body opposition as the primary influence of all Western thought. And as we move forward, this division is almost never challenged. It becomes the dominant theme in Christianity almost from the outset. Once Christianity hit the Greek and Hellenistic world, the soul-body dichotomy became the primary presumption. The soul-body dichotomy means the material world is evil, and that concept starts with the Pythagoreans. Okay, hit slide 9. Should be the atomists and sophism. How long have I been going, Paul?
I don't know.
It's 3 o'clock now. What time do we get started? Is it really 3 o'clock?
Little after 2. Ask Heather, she'll know. What time did we get started, Heather?
About 2.
Okay.
About 2?
I'm going to finish the atomists, and then I think I'm going to take a break for about 5, and we can start again. Is that right?
Okay.
Okay, the atomists. We're at about 5th century BC. And here is where we start with their key development. Up till now, pretty much the progression of thought has been asymptomatic. systematic, asystematic, meaning there has been no systematic approach to the nature of things. They've kind of hunted and pecked around, they've had some ideas, they've tossed some ideas back and forth, but for the most part it's been this kind of the wild, wild west of ideas. With the atomists, this starts to change. They mark the beginning of when we start to say, hey, we now need to put this in some form of system. For the first time, thinkers tried to develop a whole approach to the primary philosophical questions: metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics. I'll get to that later. The actual, when it actually does show up, we'll get to that later. And then the next two groups, the atomists and the sophists, made an effort towards systemization. However, they did not succeed. It took until Plato to actually get there. I wanted to deal with the atomists. They had a significant impact on philosophy in general, and in science as a whole. But dealing with the scope of their thought, we'd be here for a long time. And it isn't really, their whole scope of their thought doesn't really impact Christianity as a whole. But there is one concept that they introduced that absolutely has impacted Christianity, and I'm going to get to it in a minute. This concept, of course, is actually what impacted Augustine, and of course Luther and Calvin, absolutely. So here's a very brief summary of atomist thought. Remember, the atomists, like everybody else, are trying to reconcile Heraclitus and Parmenides. The atomists were materialists. Materialism equals reality is matter in motion. Everything, including non-material or mental phenomena, is explained entirely in physical material terms. Now, materialism is not being a filthy capitalist pig. Their kind of materialism is what I just described. The atomists were pluralists. Instead of a universal, a one stuff, they said, how about if we have many, many, many stuffs? Each of these stuffs are unchangeable. And of course, the reason they arrived at this conclusion, they said, well, this will satisfy Parmenides' assertion that things are unchanging and indestructible. But the smallest unit of this universal stuff is the only thing that can move or change. And this, of course, satisfies Heraclitus. They've actually arrived at a very interesting solution to the problems posed as is. Okay, this has a serious flaw because, after all, we're looking for a one-world substance that integrates everything and explains change. The atomist explanation pretty much makes everything you see, taste, touch, smell, hear, that it would have to have its own unique stuff. The world would then collapse on itself for the sheer weight of things, and man would be lost in a total, utter, blindingly chaotic world. So they decided this new concept. All physical things have two parts: qualitative characteristics and quantitative characteristics. This evolution of thought gave them the ability to subdivide qualities, colors, smells, sounds, versus quantities, number, length, shape, motion. Pretty ingenious. See what they've done? See how they've parsed it down, given themselves the ability to categorize some things and not others? By removing quantities from consideration, they were able to reduce the number of stuffs needed to explain the universal stuff. They still needed to reconcile their ideas to Parmenides. They had a solution to absolutes, but now they needed to figure out what to do with flux. The answer to this question: are qualities real? Their logic went like this. When a man smells, is he smelling something real, or is his nose playing tricks on him? The simple answer is no, because smell is a quality based on man's nose, and the easiest way to address qualities was to conclude that nothing was real. Qualities are merely the way stuff affects man. Once again, the conclusion is that it's man's faculties that are the problem. Make a note. So in other words, it's all subjective. But this conclusion begs this question: if there are no qualities, what determines how these qualities, these things, operate? Their answer: the atomist logic went like this. The motion seen is from the physical pressure the impact of the universal stuff against other universal stuff. Of course, this mental model is what we came to understand as atoms today, but they were applying this to the realm of metaphysics. So they decided that everything you see in action is ultimately acting like the mechanistic approach that we apply in science today, but it's happening to everything. Now, can you guess what this means? If you have everything acting metaphysically, acting mechanically, what does that mean? Think for a minute. What do you have? An endless string of causation, right?
I'm gonna say abstract laws which govern the real. Right?
They govern the real, but it is determined. It is
Right.
mechanical.
Right, determined.
This is the important
Laws
point.
which determine.
Cause and effect.
But they have causal relationship, but ultimately every atom that bumps against the next atom constantly produces this chain reaction,
Right, right.
but it's all determined. And this is what they introduced into Western thought, the concept of determinism. When you hear John Calvin talking about predestination is a form of determinism, this is atomistic thought. This is where this comes from.
And is a former low voltage certified electrician. Okay, so the theory of electricity comes from this as well.
Yes, here's the thing, and you see this a lot with ancient thought. They had some, actually, this explanation of the physical world is evolutionary.
Right.
It's the way we actually conceptualize our world, it's because it's the way it works. Now, I'm making an important distinction. Mechanistically, their concept was fabulous, and it was essential to evolution in science. They were applying it to metaphysics. Do you see the distinction I'm making?
Definitely.
So the atomists, the reason we decided to call them atoms, because atomist I think in Greek means indivisible.
Right, can't be cut.
Can't be cut, right. So you have a great physical representation in atoms, they can't be cut. But in the metaphysical world, if you can't cut the metaphysical world, you have a determinist world, which is exactly the conclusion they arrived at. And my point in this instance is to show that this is where determinism actually enters the picture. And this is what absolutely affects Christianity and the evolution of Christianity from here on out. And so in summary, since everything is materialistically caused, everything is acting in accord with a materialistic nature. So as the universal stuff interacts with other universal stuff, the smallest parts of the largest entities, all outcomes are determined. Their logic continued. Since man is made up of the same universal stuff, man is then without independent will. Man's life is equally determined. And now you can understand why the atomists are important in our unfolding discussion. They were the first people to offer a systemic argument for determinism. And of course, determinism is also known as predestination and is central to Platonist Augustinian thought. With that, I'm going to take a break because I need to hit the little ball.
Okay, and for the technical Philly, hold off and let me say a few words and we'll take a 5-minute break. Okay, I know this is taxing on the brain, all right? But the reason this is so very important is to understand, leading up to John's conclusion is, one of the absolute most popular Christian ministries there is right now, huge, all right? Here is the sub-theme of their ministry. This is considered a, for lack of a better term, orthodox, evangelical, down the line Christian ministry. One of the most popular that there is on the face of the earth right now. Here's the sub-theme of their ministry. Between two worlds. Okay? An elder that is an elder on a board of one of the biggest night counseling centers in the country has a blog And the sub-theme of his blog is Between Two Spheres, Gazing at Our Heavenly Destiny. Okay? In theology, there's huge debates all the time, especially surrounding Reformed debate on as far as dispensationalist in the Bible or not dispensationalist. And you say, how could you not be a dispensationalist, at least Old Testament versus New Testament? But the argument is called continuity versus discontinuity. Okay? This all comes, what affects us in such a big way today, it comes from this.
Yes, it does.
And it lands right where we are today and affects how we do church and how we think and how Christians conduct their lives. So hang in there. You're not going to come away with every nuance and element, but you're going to come away with some very important elements.
Cool.
Okay, and we will take a 5-minute break, Philip.